A man stares at his phone at 11:47 p.m. He has been answering emails since dinner. Tomorrow morning his calendar starts at 7:30 and does not have a single empty slot until after 6 p.m. He is tired in a way that sleep does not fix. His mind hums even when his body sits still. And somewhere in the back of his head, half buried under to-do lists and notifications, is a question he has not said out loud in years. Is any of this sustainable? 3,500 years ago, a group of former slaves stood at the foot of a mountain that shook with fire and smoke, and God himself spoke into their exhaustion a command that was not about doing more. It was about stopping. Most people think the Sabbath is a day, the fourth commandment, the longest of the 10, the one with the word remember attached to it. People have argued about that day for centuries. Saturday or Sunday, ceremony or principle, still binding or nailed to the cross. And those debates usually miss the thing sitting at the center of the whole conversation. The Sabbath was never just a day. From the very beginning it was pointing towards something, or more precisely, someone. Because when you trace this commandment from a mountain in the Sinai desert all the way to a letter written to Hebrew believers in the 1st century, the shift is not subtle. It is tectonic. And what you find on the other side of that shift is not a rule that was deleted. It is a rest that opened up wider than any single day could ever hold. We are going to walk this all the way through, from creation in Genesis, through the law and the prophets, into the controversies Jesus provoked on purpose, and finally into the book of Hebrews, where the whole thing gets reframed in a way that changes how you read every Sabbath text that came before it. By the time we reach the end, you will understand why the early church made the shift it made, what the Sabbath was actually for, and what that means for you right now, exhausted at 11:47 p.m. with a calendar that never stops. So let us start where the Sabbath itself starts, not at Sinai, before that. In the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth in 6 days, and on the 7th day, Genesis chapter 2 verses 2 and 3, God ends his work and he rests. The text says, he blessed the 7th day and sanctified it. Now here is the detail that should stop you cold before you even leave the 2nd chapter of the Bible. God does not rest because he is tired. The Hebrew verb shavat means to cease, to stop, to desist from activity. God stops creating, not because his strength ran out, but because his work was complete. The rest is not recuperation. It is completion. And that distinction will echo through every page that follows. The 7th day is blessed and set apart at creation, before there is a nation of Israel, before there is a law code, before there is a covenant at Sinai. This means the rhythm of 6 and 1, 6 days of work, 1 day of cessation, is woven into the fabric of the created order. It predates Moses. It predates Abraham. It goes all the way back to the beginning. But fast forward now to Exodus chapter 20. The people of Israel have been delivered from Egypt. They are camped at the base of Mount Sinai, and God speaks the 10 Commandments out loud. Thunder and lightning, the mountain smoking, the people trembling so hard they beg Moses to mediate, so they do not have to hear God's voice directly anymore. And right there, in the 4th commandment, God says something fascinating. Exodus chapter 20 verses 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger, who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and hallowed it. Notice the reason God gives. Creation. Because God rested on the 7th day of creation, you rest on the 7th day. The Sabbath is anchored in the created order, in the pattern God himself established before sin even entered the world. And now, here is what most people miss. Moses gives the 10 Commandments a second time, in Deuteronomy chapter 5. The context is different. 40 years have passed. The generation that left Egypt has died in the wilderness. Their children stand on the edge of the promised land, and Moses repeats the commandments. But when he gets to the fourth one, he changes the reason. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 12 through 15. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work. And remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Do you see the shift? In Exodus, the reason is creation. In Deuteronomy, the reason is redemption. You rest because you were slaves, and God rescued you. The Sabbath is now tied not only to the rhythm of creation, but to the story of deliverance. And that means the rest commanded on the seventh day is not just about imitating God's pattern of work and cessation. It is about remembering that you are no longer a slave. The Sabbath is a weekly liberation, a day when nobody, not even the lowest servant in your household, is allowed to work, because you were all slaves once and God set you free. This dual foundation, creation and redemption, will become crucial when we get to the New Testament. But before we go there, we need to understand what the Sabbath actually signified under the Old Covenant, because God did not leave the meaning ambiguous. Turn to Exodus chapter 31. God has just finished giving Moses the instructions for the tabernacle, the sanctuary where he will dwell among his people. And then he circles back to the Sabbath. Verses 13 and 17. Surely my Sabbaths you shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. The Hebrew word for sign here is ot, a visible marker, a distinguishing identification. Think of a wedding ring. It points to a covenant relationship that already exists. The Sabbath was the sign of the Mosaic covenant, the visible marker that set Israel apart from every other nation. And this is the detail that changes everything when you get to the New Testament. Because if the Sabbath is a sign of a specific covenant, what happens when that covenant finds its fulfillment? A wedding ring means something when you are married. If the bridegroom himself arrives and the marriage supper comes, the ring does not vanish. It is fulfilled. It served its purpose. The prophet Ezekiel picks up this same language. Ezekiel chapter 20 verse 12. Moreover, I also gave them my Sabbaths, to be a sign between them and me, that they might know that I am the Lord who sanctifies them. And verse 20. Hallow my Sabbaths, and they will be a sign between me and you, that you may know that I am the Lord your God. The Sabbath under the Old Covenant was never merely a day off. It was a theological statement. Every seventh day, Israel announced to the watching world, and to themselves, our God is the Creator who rested from his completed work. Our God is the Redeemer who brought us out of slavery, and we belong to him in a covenant no other nation shares. But now we need to follow a thread that runs through the entire Old Testament, the thread of rest, because the Sabbath day was not the only rest God offered his people. There was another rest, a rest tied to a place. When Israel left Sinai and marched toward Canaan, God promised them a land. And repeatedly, he described that land as a place of rest. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 9 and 10. You have not yet come to the rest and the inheritance which the Lord your God is giving you. But when you cross over the Jordan and dwell in the land which the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, and he gives you rest from all your enemies round about, so that you dwell in safety. The promised land itself was presented as a rest, a place where the warfare would stop, where the wandering would end, where the people would finally dwell securely. And in the book of Joshua, it looks like they receive it. Joshua chapter 21, verses 43 through 44, says the Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to their fathers, and he gave them rest on every side. But here is the twist. Centuries after Joshua, King David writes Psalm 95, and he says something that should make you tilt your head. Psalm 95 verse 11. God declares, "So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest." David wrote that long after Joshua had already led the people into Canaan. If the rest was just the land, David would have no reason to warn his generation about failing to enter it. The rest must be something more. This is the thread the author of Hebrews will grab and pull. But before we get there, let us pause and look at what Jesus did with the Sabbath. Because Jesus walked into a world where the Sabbath had been buried under hundreds of man-made rules. The rabbis had cataloged 39 categories of forbidden work. You could not carry a burden. You could not kindle a fire. You could not untie a knot unless it was a knot that could be untied with one hand. Then it was permissible. It would be like organizing someone's emails by word count instead of by date. You would lose the story completely, and Jesus walks straight into this with what looks like calculated provocation. He heals on the Sabbath repeatedly. Matthew chapter 12, Mark chapter 3, Luke chapter 13, John chapter 5, and chapter 9. Every single gospel records Jesus deliberately healing on the seventh day, and every single one records the religious leaders' outrage. It is not that Jesus could not have healed on a different day. He is making a point. In Mark chapter 2 verse 27, he makes the point explicit. The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. That sentence alone dismantles centuries of regulation. The Sabbath is a gift, not a burden. It was designed to serve human beings, not to enslave them. And then he says the line that pushes the controversy into open conflict. Verse 28, "Therefore the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath." Lord of the Sabbath. Not just an interpreter of the Sabbath. Not just a reformer of Sabbath practice. The Lord of it. The one who owns it, who stands over it, who has authority to define what it means. If the Sabbath was the sign of the covenant between God and Israel, then the one who is Lord of the Sabbath is the one who made that covenant in the first place. This is Jesus claiming divine prerogative, and the religious leaders understood exactly what he was doing. That is why, just a few verses later in Mark chapter 3 verse 6, they begin plotting how to kill him. Now Jesus never commanded his followers to stop keeping the Sabbath. He kept it himself. He went to the synagogue on the Sabbath, Luke chapter 4 verse 16 tells us, as his custom was. But he fundamentally reoriented the conversation around it. The Sabbath was not about rule-keeping. It was about restoration. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? He asks in Mark chapter 3 verse 4. The silence that follows is deafening. After Jesus' resurrection, something shifts. The early church, composed almost entirely of Jewish believers at first, continues to worship at the temple and in synagogues, but they also begin meeting on the first day of the week. Acts chapter 20 verse 7 records the disciples gathering on the first day to break bread. 1 Corinthians chapter 16 verse 2 shows Paul instructing the Corinthian church to set aside their offerings on the first day of the week. The resurrection happened on the first day. Pentecost happened on the first day. A new creation dawned on the first day, just as the old creation finished on the seventh. But here is what most people never realize. There is no command in the New Testament to observe Sunday as a new Sabbath, not one verse. What you find instead is the apostles deliberately refusing to impose the Sabbath on Gentile believers. When the Jerusalem Council meets in Acts chapter 15 to decide what the law requires of non-Jewish Christians, the Sabbath is conspicuously absent from their list. Circumcision is addressed. Idol food is addressed. The Sabbath is not mentioned. Not because they forgot, because something had changed. Paul states the principle openly in Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 and 17. So let no one judge you in food or in drink, or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbaths, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ. The Greek word for shadow is skia, the dark outline cast by a solid object. The shadow is real. It has a shape. It tells you something about what is casting it. But the shadow is not the substance. The Sabbath days, Paul says, along with the festivals and the new moons of the Old Covenant calendar, were shadows. The body, along in the soma in Greek, the solid reality that casts that shadow, belongs to Christ. Imagine standing outside a concert hall. The shadow of the building falls across the street, and from the shadow you can tell there is something enormous and real behind you. But you would never walk up to the shadow and try to open the shadow's door. You would never lay a picnic blanket on the shadow's floor. The shadow is evidence of the substance, not a replacement for it. The Sabbath was the shadow. Christ is the building. Paul says the same thing from a different angle in Romans chapter 14, verses 5 and 6. One person esteems one day above another. Another esteems every day alike. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day, observes it to the Lord, and he who does not observe the day, to the Lord he does not observe it. The day has become a matter of conscience, not covenant obligation. That is a monumental shift, and Paul does not treat it as controversial. He treats it as settled. If this is helping you see these connections in a way you have not seen them before, take a second and share this with someone who loves digging into the Bible. Hit subscribe so you do not miss what comes next, because we are just getting to the part that ties it all together. Now we come to the book of Hebrews, and Hebrews is going to do something with the Sabbath that no other New Testament book does. It is going to take the word rest and weld it directly to the person of Jesus Christ. The author of Hebrews, and no one knows for certain who wrote it, is writing to Jewish believers who are under pressure. Persecution is rising. Some are tempted to go back to the old covenant system, back to the temple, back to the sacrifices, back to the familiar rhythms of Judaism. And the author's entire argument is this: what you had under the old covenant was a shadow. What you have in Christ is the substance. Do not go back to the shadow when you have the reality. Chapters 3 and 4 of Hebrews form a single sustained argument about rest, and it is built around that Psalm 95 text we looked at earlier. Hebrews chapter 3, verses 7 through 11, quotes the song in full. Today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Then the author does something brilliant. He argues in layers. First layer, the generation that came out of Egypt failed to enter God's rest because of unbelief. They saw the miracles, they heard the voice, and they still refused to trust God. Their bodies fell in the wilderness. They never entered the land. Second layer, Joshua did lead the next generation into Canaan, but if that land had been the ultimate rest, David would not have spoken centuries later about a rest still available. Hebrews chapter 4 verse 8. For if Joshua had given them rest, then he would not afterward have spoken of another day. Joshua's rest was partial, temporary, geographical. It pointed towards something greater, but it was not the thing itself. Third layer, there remains therefore a rest for the people of God. Hebrews chapter 4 verse 9. Now this is the verse where the Greek stops you in your tracks. The word for rest here is not the same Greek word the author has been using. 8 times in Hebrews chapters 3 and 4, the author uses the word katapausis. That word means rest, cessation, a resting place. It is the word the Greek Old Testament uses for the rest of the Promised Land and the rest God entered at creation. Katapausis is a general word for rest. But in verse 9, the author switches words. He uses sabbatismos. This is the only occurrence of sabbatismos in the entire New Testament. It is formed from the Greek verb sabbatizo, which means to keep the Sabbath. Sabbatismos specifically means a Sabbath keeping, a Sabbath rest, a celebration of the seventh-day pattern. The author could have used katapausis again. He chose not to. Think about what this means. After arguing that the rest of the Promised Land was not ultimate, after showing that David held out the promise of a rest still to come, the author reaches back past Joshua and past Moses and past Sinai all the way to Genesis chapter 2. He uses a word that deliberately evokes the seventh day of creation, the day God ceased from his completed work, and he says that rest remains. Not a day remains. A rest remains. a sabbatismos, a participation in the very rest God entered when creation was finished and everything was very good. The author then connects this rest directly to the work of Christ. Verse 10. For he who has entered his rest has himself also ceased from his works as God did from his. The one who enters this rest stops striving. He ceases from his own works the way God ceased from his. And verse 14 tells us why this is possible. Seeing then that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. The rest is not a day on the calendar. The rest is a person. The rest is what Jesus accomplished and what Jesus now ministers as high priest in the heavenly sanctuary. The Old Covenant Sabbath pointed to a weekly cessation from physical labor. The New Covenant rest is a permanent cessation from the work of trying to make yourself righteous. You stop working for your salvation because the work is done. The price is paid. The veil is torn. The high priest has sat down, and the sitting down is the whole point. In the Old Covenant tabernacle, there were no chairs. The priests stood because their work was never finished. Jesus sat down at the right hand of God, Hebrews chapter 10, verse 12, because his work was complete. The Hebrew word shavat, to cease, to stop. The Greek word sabbatismos, the Sabbath rest. They converge here in the person of Jesus. The original command said, stop working 1 day a week. The fulfilled reality says, stop working for your salvation forever. Enter into what Christ has already done. Now here is the detail that ties this entire chain together. Go all the way back to Genesis chapter 2. God rests on the seventh day, not because he is tired, but because the work of creation is complete. Go to Exodus chapter 20. Israel rests on the seventh day, because God the Creator rested. Go to Deuteronomy chapter 5. Israel rests because God the Redeemer delivered them from slavery. Go to Joshua. The people enter a land of rest, partial, incomplete, temporary. Go to David in Psalm 95. He warns his generation not to harden their hearts and miss the rest that is still available. Go to Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 and 29. Jesus opens his arms and says, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, and you will find rest for your souls." Go to Hebrews chapter 4. There remains a sabbatismos for the people of God. Go to Revelation chapter 14, verse 13. A voice from heaven says, "Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on, that they may rest from their labors, and their works follow them." One thread, Genesis to Revelation, creation to new creation. A shadow for 1,500 years, and then the substance arrives. The Bible does not repeat itself accidentally. When the same image surfaces in Genesis and Revelation, in the law and in the letters, you are looking at something the author of the whole story wanted you to find. So what does this mean for you right now? Because you did not come here for a theology lecture. You came here with a real question about a real day and what you are supposed to do with it. First, the creation principle of a 6-in-1 rhythm is not abolished. It is built into your body and your brain the same way it was built into the cosmos. You are not designed to run 7 days a week. The man staring at his phone at 11:47 p.m. does not need a new rule. He needs a new rhythm. Taking a full day to cease from work, to rest, to worship, to remember that you are not a machine, that is wisdom. It is not a covenant obligation that determines your standing with God. It is a creational gift that sustains your life with God. The Sabbath was made for man. That has not changed. What has changed is that the day itself is no longer the sign of a covenant you are not under. Second, the rest that the Sabbath pointed toward is not something you earn. It is something you enter by faith. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 3 says, "For we who have believed do enter that rest." Present tense, active, ongoing. The Greek verb for enter is eisarkomai, and it is in the present middle or passive voice, indicating an action you participate in, but do not generate on your own. You do not manufacture this rest. You step into it. You receive it. And the way you step into it is by believing that what Jesus accomplished is sufficient. If you are still trying to be good enough for God, you have not entered the rest. If you are still afraid that one mistake will undo your standing, you have not entered the rest. The Sabbatismos of Hebrews 4 is the rest of a finished work, and it is available to you right now on a Tuesday morning, in traffic, in a cubicle, at 11:47 p.m. with a phone in your hand. It is not attached to a day. It is attached to a person. And maybe the part that stays with me most is this. God rested when the work was done, not when he ran out of energy, when the work was complete. On the cross, Jesus said 3 words in Greek, tetelestai. It is finished, paid in full, completed, and then he rested. Not in a garden tomb. That was the Sabbath day in the grave. He rose on the first day of a new creation. The rest he now offers you is not an escape from the world. It is the peace of knowing that the thing that matters most has already been handled by someone who loves you. You do not have to solve it. You do not have to earn it. You do not have to maintain it. You just have to trust the one who finished it. The Sabbath was never just a day. It was an arrow pointing to the rest your soul was made for. And the arrow has landed. If this opens something up for you, help us reach someone else with it. Subscribe, leave a comment. Even one word helps more people find this. Share it with someone who needs to hear that the rest they are looking for is not another day off. It is a person. Pray for us. God bless you.